So welcome to tonight's program with Nancy Pearl and Jeff Schwager. I'm Stesha Brandon. I'm the Literature and Humanities Program Manager at the Seattle Public Library. And as we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land, specifically the land of the Coast Salish people and the Duwamish people specifically. We honor their elders past and present, and we thank them for their stewardship of this land. So tonight's event with Nancy and Jeff is presented in partnership with Seattle City of Literature and our good friends over at University Bookstore. And we are very grateful to tonight's event sponsors, the Seattle Public Library Foundation, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, Seattle City of Literature, and the Seattle Times. And I'm super excited to get started, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce tonight's guests. Jeff Schwager is a writer, editor, producer, and playwright who's also had a successful career as an entertainment and media executive. He's written extensively on books, movies, music, and theater. And back in 2013, Book It Repertory Theater produced his acclaimed adaptation of Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son. And then the following year, the company's 5-hour stage version of his dramatization of Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay won Theater Puget Sound's prestigious Gregory Award for Outstanding Production in 2014. And Nancy Pearl is a best-selling author, librarian, literary critic, and devoted reader. And I had to leave that in here in your bio for this event because I think that's a big part of why you made the book, right? Nancy can be heard on NPR's Morning Edition and KWGS-FM in Tulsa, Oklahoma, discussing her favorite books. And she has a wonderful show on the Seattle channel, Book Blessed with Nancy Pearl, which features authors, poets, and other literary figures in conversation with Nancy. Among her many, many honors are, she was awarded the 2011 Librarian of the Year Award from Library Journal and the 2011 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. Nancy is the creator of the internationally recognized program, If All Seattle Read the Same Book, which has been going on since 1998, I believe, and has spread internationally. It's happening in every state here in the US and all around the world. And Nancy was also the inspiration for the Archie McPhee Library Action Figure. And I think more recently, Library Superhero Action Figure. So Nancy and Jeff are here tonight to talk about their new book, The Writer's Library, The Authors You Love on the Books That Changed Their Lives. So welcome, Nancy and Jeff.
Thank you, Stesha.
Yay.
We're so happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad to see you both. It's just lovely. And I so enjoyed reading the book. You know, it was super fun to get insight into the individual writers, but it was also such a lovely way to get to know both of you as well as you were sharing your own enthusiasms. I would love to hear a little bit more about the idea behind the project and how did it all come about?
Well, it was Jeff's idea, so I'm going to let him tell the story, the origin story.
The origin story, yes. Well, I interviewed Nancy for a project I was working on for the Washington State Jewish Historical Society called Agents of Change, 20 Remarkable Jewish Women of Washington State. And Nancy was at the very top of that list, I'd like to say. And she and I just hit it off. We had a great time over the course of that interview, and after that we decided we'd get together for lunch, and then we started having lunch regularly where we would talk about our love of books and whatever else came to mind, and we just really hit it off as friends. And I had this idea for a book called The Writer's Library, which would be a sort of coffee table book that would have photos of writers' libraries and then interviews with the writers about the books in their library. And after I got to know Nancy really well and felt that she and I could work together without ruining our friendship, I asked her if she would be interested in working on that with me, and she said no. She said she didn't want to do a coffee table book. It was not her thing. She didn't like coffee table books. But if I was interested in doing a book of interviews, she would be interested. And I said, great. all I really want to do is talk to writers and hang out with you. So let's do it. And I'll let Nancy take over from there.
So I wrote to my agent, Victoria Sanders, and said, you know, here are two ideas. One is a coffee table book, and the other is a collection of interviews. And she immediately wrote back and said, no coffee table book. That is not your brand. So now Jeff and I talk a lot about brands. You know, that is not your brand, Nancy, but a book of interviews of authors, yes. She said, before I go out and try to sell this, I want you to interview, you know, give us some sample interviews. Give us 10. I said, we're not doing 10 interviews. That's ridiculous. Totally. It's, I mean, these interviews, you know.
Yeah, it would have been half the book, basically.
It would have been half the book. Right. So we decided, well, I decided when I was talking to Victoria that we would do 3 interviews, that was plenty. And the first person that we interviewed, just by chance, Jonathan Lethem, was in town to promote his new book, The Feral Detective, his new book then, The Feral Detective. And we interviewed him in his hotel room in downtown Seattle. And
at the Four Seasons, if anybody wants to know where Jonathan Lethem stays.
That's right, the Four Seasons.
Makes sense.
And one of the things about the interviews is that we didn't go into any of these interviews with a set list of questions. It wasn't like we came up with 24 questions, and we didn't send the author questions in advance. We started usually every interview with me saying something like, did you grow up as a reader? You know, did you come from a reading family? And so that's why every interview in the book is so wonderfully different from every other interview, because after that first question, we just let the writers talk. And, you know, we would get a comment in or ask a question, but they really directed directed where that interview would go. And so after Jonathan, we thought, oh, you know, we have some really wonderful writers in Seattle. How about if we interview Charles Johnson? And I have to say here that the writers who agreed to have us interview them, the majority of the interviews in the book were done in those writers' homes. So, you know, their generosity in giving us, you know, 3 hours. I mean, these were long interviews, and they would have been longer, but I made Jeff stop talking because because it was way too long. You know, so we interviewed Charles Johnson, and that was a wonderful, wonderful interview. Because you learn so much about a person and a writer when you talk about what books they've read. And then the third interview that we did was with Lori Frankel. And that also was very different from the other two. And every interview of those 3 was so different. And then, you know, HarperCollins said they would love to publish it. And Jeff and I then, you know, really got down to the down and dirty work of choosing the writers that we wanted to interview. And Jeff and I are wholehearted in our love of the writer John O'Hara. But aside from John O'Hara and a few other writers, we both made lists of the writers that we would want to interview. And of course there were overlaps, and those overlaps were basically the authors that we started with. And then after that, you know, I don't want to say there were fisticuffs, and I don't even think there were voices raised, but we had some good discussions, didn't we, Jeff? About
yes.
Interview. And why don't you talk about the, you know, our view of that these are all American authors, but it's America writ large.
Yes, well, these are all American authors, but it's America writ large, in the sense that we really wanted to get the sort of a vision of the melting pot of America. We focused as much as we could on different voices. We have a couple of writers who identify as refugees in Viet Thanh Nguyen and Maza Mengistu. Viet came over from Vietnam when he was very young, and Maza came from, I believe, Ethiopia when she was very young. We have Leila Lalami came here from Morocco. Luis Alberto Urrea was born in Tijuana and spent the early part of his childhood there, but then moved to San Diego as a young kid and talked a lot to us about sort of how his life straddled that border. His mother was American and his father was Mexican, and how they kind of had a war over his, his, what he would be. Would he be Mexican or would he be American? And that was a really fascinating thing to learn about someone, very intimate thing to learn about someone. We traveled all over the country. We twice to California, twice to the East Coast. We drove around New England to meet as many writers in their homes as we could.
Don't forget Minnesota.
Yes, we flew to Minnesota to meet Louise Erdrich, who's a writer we both admire deeply. And again, that was a Native voice, and that was really important to us to have a Native American author represented in the book, and to hear what it was like growing up in a country that her people were here first, but the books that she read did not necessarily feature those voices and those characters, and it was very interesting to hear about that.
I would love to talk a little bit about this idea of American literature, like about sort of what I think you talk about in the introduction about the changing canon. And I linked that a little bit to Leila Lalami's idea. Like, she was talking about how, Moroccan literature, she doesn't think of it as a national literature so much anymore, but as transnational because of the diaspora. And so I was curious, do you think that what, can you talk a little bit more about the changing canon here in American literature, what that looks like? Do you have thoughts about that as it's reflected in the book, or?
Oh, Jeff, do you want to go?
Well, I mean, certainly it's, if you want to look at what makes up, I think, the intellectual canon of American literature, you'd look at the books that are winning the big prizes now. And so two of the writers that we interviewed, Viet Thanh Nguyen, just won the Pulitzer Prize for The Sympathizer. Susan Choi won the National Book Award for Trust Exercise. Those are two writers that we interviewed. Maza Mengistu has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which is amazing. She's a writer born in Ethiopia, living in the United States, and shortlisted for the most prestigious British literary award. So I think, when we talk about the canon, these are writers who are establishing themselves as writers in the American canon now. Nancy, do you want to sort of?
No, I think that's, I think finally America, the United States, is catching up to other countries in the amount of translations, for example, that we're getting. It used to be that you would go into a bookstore in Paris, say, and there were all of these American authors. I mean, I remember going to a library in Tallinn,
Estonia.
In Tallinn, Estonia, and there were two big shelves of Terry Pratchett novels. Now, he's British, but these were translated Terry Pratchett novels. And American writers, Michener, for example. But we were so, the translations were always seen as not being big sellers in the United States, that people would not be interested in translated works. But I think now people are interested in translated works, and there are publishers whose books are primarily translations. Europa Publishers, for example, is one of those, and I think that's really, really, really wonderful.
Yeah. In fact, we asked, one person we asked was Leila Lalami, was there a Moroccan book that she would be interested in translating? And now the title of the book is going to escape me, but she talked about how she had written 50 pages of a translation and sent it to, was it New York
New
Review?
York Review Books, right?
Yeah, and never heard back from them. And she had done all that work, and we were like, well, you should now go back to them again. She was since nominated for the National Book Award last year for her amazing novel, The Other Americans, that she should go back to them and say, hey, come on, let's do this. And I think we talked to all the writers who spoke other languages about were there books from their native language that they would be interested in translating, and that got some interesting answers.
Yeah, for sure. That just for the note, the book was by Driss, I think it's Trabi, and it's called The Simple Past, in case anybody wants to look
Translate it.
Yes, you'd have to read Moroccan.
Publish the translation.
Right.
Right. You have to read Moroccan in order to get there. But
or ask Leila for the first 50 pages.
Right. And see.
I'm sure she'd be happy to give them to you. She's a really lovely person.
She's super nice. I was super interested to see how many authors mentioned that their love of reading was sort of started with science fiction and fantasy. And yet so many of those authors have gone on to not write science fiction and fantasy, or what we wouldn't, generally call that. Although I did love that Viet Thanh Nguyen did name check Jonathan Letham's, one of his books. And I thought that was kind of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Jonathan's really the only one who has written sci-fi among the writers, I think, that we covered.
Did you get a sense of why, like, where that divide or that schism happened? Like, they loved it as kids, and then when they got older, they...
Well, I think that one of the reasons that kids love, that often you can get reluctant readers to start reading with science fiction, is because two aspects of science fiction and fantasy. One is the world building. What makes a good science fiction or fantasy novel is the world building. You have to believe that world. And the other is that, especially books, science fiction books for kids, Robert Heinlein, for example, those are really good page turners. Those are really good stories. Yeah, I think both of those are reasons why. And in fact, Dave Eggers. Now, when I thought about Dave Eggers, I assumed that he was a reader from way, way, way back. That he loved to read. I don't know why I assumed this, but I did. And then he said, no, he was not a reader as a young kid, that he had a little bit of dyslexia, and he was another writer who had a little bit of dyslexia and wasn't an early reader at all was Richard Ford. But Dave Eggers said, but the book that really turned him into a reader was Dune, the Frank Herbert novel. And that he said, he remembers being in high school, but he wasn't in high school, he was in Dune, he was inside that book. So, but I think for some of these writers, maybe an emphasis on story isn't as important. So the books that they're writing aren't necessarily story driven. They have other things that are urging them on.
Well, I think that the writers that Nancy and I tended to choose were not writers who were story first writers, that our taste has much more to do with the beauty of the writing. And so the writers, that's who we tended to interview. Actually, one other writer who sort of wrote a science fiction book and it won the Hugo Award for best science fiction book was Michael Chabon, whose Yiddish Policemen's Union actually won that award. And it's a kind of alternative reality book, but it's not what I would call science fiction.
No, although I have such admiration for his ability. He's such a chameleon in his
Yeah,
books, and
Yeah.
I also have an abiding love of Sherlock Holmes, so I
me too.
bond with him
Yeah.
about that.
Right.
So
Yes.
yeah, well, I'm curious to. This is opening a little bit of a can of worms here, and we do only have the hour to talk, but I am kind of curious about this idea of genre and literary fiction and that tension between them, because, and it came up, I think, in a lot of the interviews. And I think that, you know, I think Viet Thanh Nguyen was the person who pushed back a little bit and said, well, I only am going to say that's genre if we can also say that literary fiction is a genre too, or something like to that effect, right? So can we talk a little bit about that, about your thoughts on genre and all of that? And maybe start with you, Nancy, and then we'll.
Sure. So my thoughts on genre is that we should ban that word from our vocabularies.
Decided.
Yeah, right,
Okay.
right. That there are better ways of thinking about books than thinking in terms of literary fiction and as opposed to genre. To me, what calling books, talking about genres, is to really ghettoize those books. And within genres, what you're doing is, you have the lowest of the low, that's, which are either Westerns or romances. This is not my view. I'm just saying what it is.
Western romances.
Yeah, or Western romances, even better. I love those, and then science fiction and mysteries. I mean, and you could tell how when somebody reviews a mystery that they love, or a science fiction, or a romance, or whatever, a Western, they always say it transcends the genre, which is a phrase that makes me wanna, if you'll excuse me, puke. I hate that because books do different things for different people, and no two people read the same book. And to say that one book is lesser because it all ends up happily ever after, I'm not, that doesn't make me happy. It doesn't make me happy as a librarian. It doesn't make me happy as a reader. So I feel really strongly that we need to just stop that. And I would be very happy if our libraries all over the country, the world, would not be arranged by by mainstream fiction, non-genre fiction, and then have those genre divisions.
Yeah.
So,
Have you all seen, there's some organizing show on Netflix right now where they're organizing books in like a rainbow. And
yeah.
that is making me crazy.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Jeff, Nancy was very decisive.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to take a counterpoint or?
No counterpoint. I mean, I love quality books, regardless of their genre labels. Right now I'm reading The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell, and that has its fantasy elements, but it's just a wonderful book. And talking to all the writers in the book, I mean, they all like books that had genre labels attached to them, to one degree or another. I mean, Andy Greer, I remember talking to him about Raymond Chandler, and a lot of writers talked about Raymond Chandler, of course, who is a writer who opened so many doors for me. I mean, as a young reader, reading Chandler, I was drawn in by the mystery and the plot elements, but I fell in love with Chandler because he was such a beautiful writer. And I think that's, people, as Nancy says, people will find what they want to find and what they need to find in any book that they love. And, it can be in any genre. And I like books in all sorts of different genres. So
Yeah.
Westerns, for example, I love Westerns. I love Western movies, and I love Western novels, old, Louis L'Amour novels. And
wasn't it Louise Erdrich, who talked about her collection of signed Louis L'Amour novels.
That's right, it
How much
was,
he
yeah.
loved those books.
Yeah.
Which was really interesting, of course,
Yes.
because she's Native American, and
Right.
we talked to her quite a bit about, you know, the way Native Americans were represented in Westerns. So yeah, I think genre is, I mean, it's useful for some people. My father only reads mysteries. You know, he's 85 years old, and I'm delighted that he, you know, that he gets excited when one of his favorite writers comes out with a new book. Michael Connelly is his favorite writer, probably, and when Michael Connelly has a new book out, my father's always first in line at the library to get it, and that's wonderful. And I would never condescend to somebody who has a preference in one of the so-called genres.
Yeah, I loved Jonathan Letham's. He mentions that there are secret genres. You know, the idea
Yeah.
of secret genres, and I loved that idea. Even though I'm with you, Nancy, on sort of eradicating that term, but I
Mhm.
love the idea that there are these collections of books that have like resonance with each other, and they sort of are of a kind. You know.
Yeah. Jonathan is so brilliant. I
Oh,
just have to say. I mean,
yeah.
the guy is just off the charts brilliant. And talking to him as our very first interview for the book, I mean, it sort of made us want to do so many, you know, made us want to do this so much more, because it's like, wow, that was some conversation.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think the book is filled with those kinds of interviews.
Yeah.
The interview with
Thank
Michael
you.
Chabon and Eilette Waldman is also fun because you get to
Yeah.
see their interactions.
Right.
And yeah,
Right.
that's super fun. I also was interested to see how some of the authors are really completists, you know, in terms of like they find a person that they love, they want to read all of their books. And then others are a little bit more scattershot in their approach. And I am wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and also how about you? How do you read? Are you completists or?
I am not a I am not a completist. I think I am much more scattershot. That's a good word. I'm trying to think of who. Well, on the other hand, though, I did recently reread all of the Nero Wolfe, the mysteries by Rex Stout. I reread all of them in publication order. And we talked about that. For some reason, it came up in the interview with Amor Tolles.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, he did that.
Yeah.
You remember that he had
Yeah.
read
Yeah.
something in publication order. And I think I think he is a completist.
I got that sense for
Yeah.
sure.
Yes, Amor. I think Michael Chabon seemed to be very much a completist earlier in his life, and now he only rereads for the most part, unless it's a friend's book. Ayelet says that the reason is that that way he knows he's getting a good book. So.
Yeah.
It's true, you know that
Yeah.
you know what you're getting. I did love, I think I was mentioning this to you earlier, but I did love how Charles Johnson was talking about wanting to read all of the work by an author, not just sort of the celebrated work, because in seeing their process in the work that wasn't as accomplished, you got to see them in their underwear. And I loved that idea of,
Yeah.
you know, that still being valuable, and
Right.
also just, you know, them hanging out in their underwear.
Yeah, I'm actually a completist. I will tend to read everything by an author. If I read one book by an author that I love, I'm going to want to read everything by that author. And I also tend to feel like if an author is good, then it almost doesn't matter which of their books you read, that you're going to find something really wonderful in it. And even as I say that, I can think of contradictions, but like F.
They
Scott
prove the rule.
Fitzgerald, for example, there's not much to love in The Beautiful and Damned. And the one play he wrote, The Vegetable, is truly awful.
The
So,
Vegetable.
but yeah, it was in 1923, I think, he wrote this play, The Vegetable, in between The Beautiful and Damned and The Great Gatsby. He was always looking for ways to make money because he and Zelda love to spend money so much. Yeah, but so the play was terrible. It bombed, and he went on to write The Great Gatsby. So I think he learned his lesson.
Right. That is, yeah. Um, so I thought, I'm trying to decide, we only have a little bit of time left, you know, before we go to the audience questions, and I want to pick and choose the best questions for you. I think that I was interested to see, this is not a short question or short answered question, but I thought it was really interesting that several of the authors were talking about the revelation that came to them, usually I think as a teen, that, you know, writing fiction would allow them to address serious topics, like that novels could address serious topics as well as nonfiction could, you know. And I can think of a couple folks that mentioned that, and I was interested to know, do you have thoughts about that, about sort of the role that fiction has in you know, sort of revealing ourselves to ourselves?
Well, I mean, I think that fiction can tell. There's a wonderful quote that like nonfiction can tell you the history, but fiction can tell you the truth of that history. And I feel as though this is a book that is primarily fiction writers. There's one poet. That was kind of accidental. There were nonfiction writers that we really wanted to include, including Susan Orlean, but we couldn't. With Susan, she was on the East Coast when we were on the West Coast, and vice versa. We just couldn't get to her in the amount of time that we had before we had to turn in the manuscript. But we did want to include, we would have liked to include nonfiction. But for me, I think that what fiction can do is I think that fiction can open a world to us in a way that nonfiction often can't. Now, narrative nonfiction, the kind of nonfiction that Tim Egan writes, yes, that's amazing nonfiction.
Yeah.
You know, he's a wonderful, wonderful writer. But I think I'm thinking of The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. Sure, you could tell the story of Vietnamese refugees in the United States and what that was like, but the way that Viet has chosen to tell it, with that main character who has a deep secret in his life, it really brings it all home in a much more powerful way, I think.
Yeah, more visceral.
Much more visceral.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think fiction allows you to really explore the depth of someone's psyche in a way that nonfiction rarely does. You know, you can really go deep inside someone. I think of a much lighter book than The Sympathizer, but A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles is a book where you know, we get to experience essentially the first 40 years of Soviet history through the eyes of the Count Rostov, but at the same time we also explore, you know, his experience of essentially exile within a hotel inside, in the middle of his country, and what that does to somebody psychologically, and how he copes with that. It's a really beautiful book, and it's not something that, no matter how much you read of Russian history, you'll never get that viewpoint. And you know, the fact that Amor imagined that history makes it all the more amazing that that he goes so deep into it. I don't know. I was blown away by that book, and
Yeah, I have to tell you, well, first of all, I think it's a good pandemic book, right?
yeah.
Lockdown.
Right.
But I have to say, I tried to read, I had an unusual experience with that book where I tried to read the print version of it because I was excited to read it, and I couldn't get through it. I tried twice, and then I listened to the audio version, and I just couldn't get enough. I was just in love. The reader was amazing, and it was just so interesting to have that experience. And And I'm so thrilled that I actually did read the book, that I got to experience it, because it's an amazing, amazing book. But yeah, it's funny. That has never happened to me before, where, I tried to read it and,
That happened to me once, strangely, with the Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael
Oh,
Chabon.
yeah.
I could not get into the rhythm of the sentences as I was trying to read it on the page. And what I ended up doing was listening and reading along to the audiobook.
Okay.
And that allowed me to hear I believe it was Peter Riegert, who's quite
It was,
a
yeah.
good actor, reading that. And so having him sort of guide me through the rhythms of those sentences, which, try to capture a certain kind of, I don't know, is Yiddishkeit the correct word, Nancy? I mean, it's a kind of
I think,
Eastern European flow to the sentences that Michael was after in that book. And I've since reread the book without the audiobook, and just, I love that book. I mean, it would have been such a loss not to have had that experience
Yeah,
with the audiobook.
There's that wonderful line in that book that I just loved, that where he compares I think it's toward the beginning, where he's talking about the sodium lights in the town, and he talks about how the light that it casts is the color of chicken schmaltz. And I was just like, it's so vivid, right? I love it.
yeah.
Well, so there are so many wonderful writers in the collection, included in the collection. I think this is not the published book. This is an advanced copy, because I had to read it before the interview, but you can get your copy that looks like Nancy's from University Bookstore or from the library. But there are so many wonderful writers like Russell Banks and T.C. Boyle, Jennifer Egan, who we haven't talked about yet at all, Jane Hirschfield, the wonderful poet, Madeline Miller, Donna Tartt, all sorts of wonderful authors. Were there folks that you would love to include in the Writers Library 2.0, part 2?
God, yes.
Well, I was going to say the Librarian Reckoning. I don't know. Who would you include? Sky's the limit.
Well,
Lori Moore.
Yeah, we really wanted to interview. Lori Moore was certainly on both our lists, high up on both our lists. We're just both huge fans of Lori Moore. Tobias Wolff, we both really wanted to interview. We tried to interview Alice Munro, but she's elderly and not well. And the same for Toni Morrison. We tried to do that.
She actually passed away right after we talked to Russell Banks, who was a good friend of hers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was a month, if memory serves.
And I think Ursula Le Guin is somebody that I wish that we had interviewed. She shows up in many of the interviews as well. The writers have, talked about her, but most wonderfully, I think, in Luis Urrea's interview, where Ursula Le Guin was really a mentor to him and was the reason why he was first published. And he tells a wonderful story about Ursula Le Guin's advice to him about writing about women in his books, which I will let people discover on their own.
Yes, you have to read the book.
Right.
It's great. I love it. Well, we are going to go to audience questions in just a minute. So I see we have a question coming in already. And folks, if you haven't got your question queued up, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But I think we'll close my little section of the interview here by just, you're both writers, obviously. We have this wonderful book. And for those of you who may not have read Nancy's novel, George and Lizzie, it's also wonderful, and you should totally read that.
Very funny and very warm, a really beautiful book. I read it before I knew Nancy, and it made me that much more excited when I met her.
Yes, charming.
Beautiful book.
Very fun, and yeah.
Thank you.
Totally read it. But, so you're both writers. How would you answer your own questions? And we don't have 3 hours to do that, but sort of, I think you're motivating question was about how reading informs the life of the writer. And do you have thoughts that you would like to share about how that's impacted your writing? Did I put you on the spot?
Well, I mean, what was interesting to me, I mean, reading is all I've ever done in my life. And I've sort of arranged my life around reading. You know, I became a librarian. That's all I did as a child. That's all I do pretty much as an adult. But when it comes to writing fiction, you know, I don't think that my reading, what my reading did was show me the kind of book that I loved and the kind of book that I wanted to write. So that's what my love of reading did.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
any
I think for me, the reading is just the most pleasurable experience. It's the last thing I do every night for a couple of hours in order to escape the world that we're living in, and hopefully go to a different place and a better place. But even if it's not a better place, it's a different place. And I love that you can travel all over the world without leaving your chair. And that's a really wonderful, profound experience that we all get from reading, I think.
So I read to escape as well. I mean, you know, that's what I've done since I was a child. I read to escape. But Russell Banks, when we talked to him about it, he had a very interesting take on that. He said he doesn't read to escape, he reads to enter into. And, you know, I've been trying, ever since we talked to him almost a year ago, I think, I've been trying to think of what the difference is, or is there a difference, or
Well, I mean, I think it's a bit of a distinction without a difference, but it's definitely a different way of looking at it. It's
right.
a way of saying that, you know, it's not that there's anything wrong with the world I'm in, but that I want to see other worlds as well. I want to enter other worlds as well. And I think, you know, for me, especially today in the world, there is something wrong with the world we're in, and I'm very eager to escape it. But I also do love to enter into other worlds.
Yeah, I think it's that running to rather than running from.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But we have some questions from our audience. Wendy asks, could you please say something more about audio versus written versions of books? How do you choose? And how much does it depend on the readers? For example, Let the Great World Spin.
So what I would say is that when you're reading a book, you know, when you're reading a book in text and paper, what you're doing is creating that book with the author. You and the author together are creating this book. And I'm really, in saying that, quoting Paul Auster, who we wanted to interview as well, who is a wonderful novelist, short story writer, essayist. And he says when he's writing, he leaves space for the reader. When he's writing fiction, he leaves space for the reader. And in the end, he believes that the book, that piece of fiction is created by him and the writer, him and the reader. But when you're listening to books, a third person has entered that dynamic. And often you're not going to decide on whether you like the book or not, or whether you want to go on listening or not because of the book itself, but because of the reader. And I know I came to audiobooks late, but I am a huge audiobook fanatic now. And I'm amazed at how much the reader matters. And I don't think that's a good thing, because, you know, I'm missing out on some really, you know, books that I would like to listen to that I can't stand the reader.
I struggled through I was listening to the Magicians trilogy, the Lev Grossman. I was listening to them earlier in the lockdown, just kind of some escapist sort of fun. and the reader was, I think he's a very talented actor, so I don't mean to throw shade on him, but it was just not working for me. But I kind of listened to them despite.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it was a struggle a little bit, you know.
Right.
But,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, I've had the experience where it's an actor I love, and I still do not like the way they're reading a book. I tried to listen to Bleeding Edge by Thomas Pynchon. Specifically, I tried to listen to it because the reader was Jeannie Berlin, daughter of Elaine May, who starred in The Heartbreak Kid, directed by Elaine May. And she's an actress I find very funny and really like, and just could not listen to that book. But I have trouble in general listening to audiobooks. I just find that a difficult way to take in information, I think. And when you're reading, you're setting the pace yourself, and pace is such an important aspect in terms of experiencing a book. I can stop whenever I want. I can pause and listen to a line in my head over and over to make sense of it. And of course, when you're listening to an audiobook, you can't do that. You have to keep up with the reader. So for me, it's not as good an experience. And as I say, with Yiddish Policemen's Union, one of the best audio experiences I've had, I read along with it.
In print.
So that I had both experiences simultaneously.
Did you?
I,
go
I,
ahead, Nancy.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that I find that I'm having a lot of pleasure listening to books that I loved as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
So all of my favorite Georgette Heyer books are just wonderful. Mrs. Gaskell's books, North and South, is read by Juliet Stevenson, and you can't hardly go wrong with Juliet Stevenson. But Mothers and Daughters by Mrs. Gaskell. So many of my favorite books, I just get. Terry Pratchett. All of those, for example, they're just wonderful audiobooks, and I've read them so much, in physical format that listening to them is just a way of making the miles that I'm walking go by very quickly.
And did you read your own book? You too?
I actually did I did do the audio version of George and Lizzie, and I felt very, very pleased that I could do that, because it always seemed to me that I was the storyteller in that book. It was my voice that was telling the story of George and Lizzie. So it just didn't make sense to me that anybody else should do it. But we had a really interesting experience with the audio book of the Writers' Library. Jeff, maybe you could tell what that's.
Yeah, well, of course, we recorded all the interviews and had hoped that they would be able to use those recordings for the audiobook, but they felt that the sound quality was not up to audiobook standards, and also that there were subtle differences between what people said and the edited text that we agreed upon with the authors. We allowed all the authors to revise their text, and they wanted it to be an exact record of the book. So Nancy and I ended up reading our parts, and 5 of the 23 writers in the book agreed
or wanted
free of charge to HarperCollins to read their parts. And that was amazing to me. I didn't think any of the writers would want to spend the time doing it, but I think they wanted to get it right, and they didn't want their words interpreted by someone else. So those 5 writers were Siri Hustvedt, Wenda Levita, Luis Alberto Urrea, help me out here, Richard Ford, and Laurie Frankel, our very own Laurie Frankel. And a couple of others actually wanted to do it, but did not want to leave their homes to go to a recording studio during the pandemic.
Makes sense.
So for the other 18 writers in the book, actors read their parts, and so that was the whole experience was interesting, because Nancy and I went in on separate days because we weren't allowed to be two people in the booth together. And, so we would read our questions, and we would read, the introduction is done where it's, each of us, we're kind of conversing with each other in the introduction. And, but we did them on separate days. It was an odd experience.
It was a difficult audio book, I think, for the publishers, for HarperCollins to do. But there's a bonus in the audio book, which is excerpts in the voice of two of the writers. Excerpts.
Or two of the actual interviews.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Two of the excerpts, I think just excerpts from two of the interviews. Yeah, excerpts from two of the interviews, so you can actually hear the authors as we heard them.
Oh, so fun.
Yeah.
And that's Leila Lalami, and also Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman,
right,
together.
Oh, that's so fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have a recommendation from the audience for The Dutch House by Tom Hanks. So on audio.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah. So
Nancy's good friend, Tom Hanks, I like
Yes.
to say.
Is he your boyfriend, Nancy?
Well, I interviewed
Good friend, I said.
Arts and lectures, and he is just as lovely.
Don't tell Joe.
Yes, I love Tom Hanks.
He's like America's sweetheart, right?
Yes, he is. He is totally.
So we've got a request from Charles asking, in light of these very troubled times, could you suggest a few books which could take one away from current events? So in light of our conversation that was running toward something else.
Let's run away.
Let's say, do each of you have one question there or one recommendation there?
Well, we have one joint recommendation, I can tell you. Sermons in Soda Water by John O'Hara, which is just a wonderful evocation of life in the 1930s, told from the point of view of a man in 1960, looking back. And so you get to experience both 1960 and the 30s. It is a world very much of white privilege, and there are no characters of color, I think, in that book at all. So it's a certain kind of experience of America that never really existed for a lot of people. But as a place to escape to, it's the voice is just so beautiful and charming. And I'll let Nancy offer another suggestion.
So there's two books that are just coming out that are just out in September. And one is called Set My Heart to 5 by Simon Stevenson. I think that's his last name. Set My Heart to 5. And the other is Hench, Hench, by the author's last name is Walschatz. And I think that you're going to find both of these in the fantasy science fiction. No, you will. Yes, you will find them both. I believe in this fantasy and science fiction section, but they are both just delights to read, and especially Set My Heart to 5. I laughed. I kept reading aloud sections to my husband, and it was just such a wonderful, wonderful book. Such a warm, I don't like books. The word heartwarming I have trouble with. Just so, like heartwarming. But Set My Heart to 5 is a totally heartwarming book, and you'll love the main character, whose name is Jared, and who is an android, a bot, who lives in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and is a dentist. And I won't tell any more than that. And Hench, just
like George and Lizzie,
right,
is a dentist.
Right. And Hench takes what the author of Hench does is take all those tropes about superheroes and how great superheroes are, because they save people and all of that, and she turns them all on their heads. It's a really smart book, and the main character, Anna, her talent, she's a hench. Good guys have sidekicks, but bad guys have henchmen or henchwomen, and Anna is a henchwoman, but her big talent is manipulating data, spreadsheets, and because of her talent in doing that, something is going to happen. And I love that book, both of them.
Two more books that I had just that I've already mentioned while we're talking here: A Gentleman in Moscow and The Yiddish Policeman's Union
I would
are
agree.
wonderful examples of fiction that will just take you away from this world. Yiddish Policeman's Union is set in an alternative reality where instead of Israel, the Jews were given Alaska.
Sitka, Alaska.
Sitka, Alaska, but only until a certain year, and now the time is up. And that's wonderful. And of course, the greatest, I think, escapist fiction ever written is, and I think Nancy might agree with me on this, is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry,
right.
Which takes you back to the Old West in a way that no other book, I think, ever has. And it's, you know, just 1,000 pages of pure excitement, and you know, it's like a Saturday afternoon serial from the 30s in the level of excitement it has, but it also has depth, and it has characters that are wonderful. You know, Nancy has her 4 doors theory of reading, and am I correct that Lonesome Dove allows you to access literature through any of those 4 doors?
Right.
You want to tell us what those doors are, Nancy?
I don't think we have time. I don't think we have time.
Yes, you'll have to come to a seminar that Nancy gives on that.
Right.
Yeah. We do have time. Well, we have a comment here from Amy saying, I can't wait to see Nancy again in Port Angeles. I took a call at the local history center last week from her acquaintance Orella, who is returning to her OZET research. Thanks to Nancy. So I just wanted to pass that comment along. And then for you, Jeff, we have a question from Jenny saying, I'm wondering if Jeff can talk a little bit more about his love for Philip Roth, because it's clear from his interactions with others in the book that he is a fan.
Now, Jeff, remember that we have only a certain amount of time. So
thank you.
That sounds like a question that Nancy ceded to this to this talk somehow, because Nancy mocked me constantly for asking everybody about Philip Roth. Yeah, Philip Roth to me was the greatest American novelist, I guess. You know, maybe The Great Gatsby is the greatest American novel, but Roth wrote so many great novels, starting with his novella Goodbye Columbus, and then his Jamesian first novel, Letting Go, right to the end of his career, when he wrote just a wonderful book called Nemesis, which is about a fictional polio outbreak that hits Newark in the 1940s. The rhythm of his sentences is something that just clicks with me. When I read him, it's like listening to my favorite music. That's what I'll say about Philip Roth. And I was so delighted whenever one of the writers in the book would also be a Roth fan. Susan Choi, in particular, I recommended Nemesis to Susan Choi because she had talked about how she loved Everyman, one of Roth's late books, so much. And she went out the next day and bought Nemesis at this used bookstore in Middlebury, where she was teaching, and read it. And we talked about it recently, and she said how much she loved it. And it's actually a great book for the pandemic, because you get that feeling of kind of menace that we all feel from coronavirus, from the polio outbreak in Nemesis. So for anyone out there who hasn't read it and is open to it, I heartily recommend it.
Excellent. Well, thanks.
Good job.
Yeah, that was concise, right? I have one last question for you, which I'm just curious about because I'm nosy, which was like, y'all were traveling together on multiple times, and I'm wondering if there's any juicy behind the scenes gossip about these writers' houses, or any funny stories about the actual trips, because it just seems like a buddy comedy waiting to be filmed.
Well, I think that one of the most interesting houses was Tom Boyle's, T.C. Boyle, which is in Montecito, California, and is one of the prairie style, the Frank Lloyd Wright prairie style homes. And Tom had you know, he had put out a picnic for us on one of the porches there, and we were talking. And this is in the interview, but we were talking about his newest book then, which was about Timothy Leary and LSD, and I was saying that when I read it, you know, the LSD trip seemed so real, and you know, I thought he had done a great job describing it. And he said, "Oh, I'm glad you think so, Nancy, because I put 2 tabs of LSD in your Pellegrino," which he didn't. Somebody felt that he did. So
I don't think Nancy's ever taken LSD. I don't know. As far as I know, Nancy has never taken LSD. So when she told Tom, you know, I'll just say, you know, Tom knows more about LSD than Nancy and I do. Let's put it that way. I've never taken LSD. Another writer whose home that was I really enjoyed going to, or writers, was Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman. We had hoped to do a couple of couples, at least in the book, and in fact, Dave Eggers and Vendela Levito, we were supposed to do as a couple, and there was a scheduling problem, so we ended up doing them separately. But going to Michael and Ayelet's home was really fun. It was just fun to watch them interact, and you can get a bit of that on the audiobook in the excerpt. But they were eating peanut butter and banana sandwiches, and they offered us peanut butter and banana sandwiches, and it was a little bit like an episode of I Love Lucy, the way they interact. They're just very funny, the way they talk to each other. It's really fun to be around them. So,
yeah.
And in fact, Andrew Sean Greer is vacationing with them right now in Maine. So there's a little juicy behind the scenes gossip for you.
Oh my gosh, like that's a dream, right? Come true, right? All those fun writers and being on vacation. That sounds fun.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, the two of you. This has just been such a delight. I feel like we could just hang out and chat and gossip about these writers all day. So I wanted to let folks that are tuning in I wanted to let you know that if you are interested in reading the Writers Library, it's available at spl.org. And I think there's audio and print copies in the catalog there that you can put on hold. And then our good friends over at University Bookstore have signed copies of the book, and they are open for limited browsing or curbside pickup. And of course, you could always order the Writers Library through their website as well, and that's ubookstore.com. And then one other fun note is that Nancy and Jeff are happy to personalize book plates to be mailed as well. So if you wanted to get the book inscribed to you specifically or to a friend, that they're happy to do that. And so if you'd like to have a personalized book plate, you just need to email admin, that's ADMIN, at nancypearl.com. So thank you so much, Nancy and Jeff. It's just been such fun to hear about the Writers Library. And I want to take a minute to thank tonight's sponsors, the Seattle Public Library Foundation, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, Seattle City of Literature, and the Seattle Times. And of course, thanks to everybody who's here tonight. Even though we can't see you, we can feel the love. And thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Stasha.
Thanks, Stasha, and thanks for everyone who's tuning in.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.